The US State Department stops nearly all foreign aid as President Donald Trump pushes his America First policy. But this assistance also helps the US achieve its foreign policy goals. So how will they be affected along with other countries and communities around the world? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. For decades, the United States has been the largest single donor of aid globally, and last year it provided more than 40% of the UN's humanitarian aid budget. And now, most foreign assistance through the State Department has been frozen for 90 days, with only emergency food programs and military aid to Israel and Egypt exempted. The aid supports initiatives ranging from health and education to security and conflict. So what could be the effects of America's freeze on aid, both for itself and other nations? And how will it reshape Washington's relations with the world? We'll discuss all of this with our panel shortly. But first, let's listen in to Joel Evans' report.
Aid has long helped the US achieve its foreign policy goals. President Donald Trump's decision to freeze almost all foreign assistance for 90 days as part of his America First strategy has upended decades of policy and is already having a global impact. In 2023, Washington distributed $72 billion of funding in nearly 180 countries. 4 days after taking office, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio sent a cable to embassies worldwide ordering a halt to US projects supporting everything from access to clean water, healthcare, education, and children's health. The President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, helps combat the spread of HIV and AIDS and is just one of the programs impacted by the freeze.
Certainly, people living with HIV should still be able to access treatment through government facilities. But the government facilities are going to come under more pressure because you're removing a whole number of staff that were otherwise being funded by the grants.
Initially, the only exemptions to the freeze were US military aid to Israel and Egypt, and the emergency food programs like the one used to help the people suffering from a widening famine in Sudan. The US system for monitoring global famine has been taken offline. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio signed an additional waiver exempting life-saving humanitarian assistance from the freeze, leaving humanitarian organizations seeking clarity on what qualifies as life-saving assistance. But the waiver does not apply to abortions, family planning, and programs that do not align with Trump's conservative policies. Humanitarian assistance programs in Ukraine have been forced to cut services and stop many social projects, including the Veteran Hub that supports soldiers and their families.
We have not been able to pay salaries or any expenses since January. This means we are not allowed to ask people to work.
The United Nations Secretary General has called for additional exemptions to be issued, but the picture remains unclear and it has endangered the lives of millions of people globally. But some recipients of aid say the freeze is an opportunity for them to work towards self-reliance.
What are we going to do, to support ourselves? Because nobody is going to continue holding out a hand there to give you. It is time for us to use our resources for the right things. We are the ones who are using them for the wrong things.
For now, the full fallout of the Trump administration's decision has yet to become clear. Humanitarian aid agencies are scrambling for clarification while doing what they can to keep providing essential care for people and communities most in need. Joel Evans, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guest now. In Westminster in the US state of Maryland, we have Dave Harden. He's a former assistant administrator for the USAID Bureau of Democracy, Conflict and Humanitarian Assistance. In Chiang Mai in Thailand, Salai Ling, director of the Chin Human Rights Organization, an NGO based in Myanmar. And in Washington, D.C., Abdullahi Boro Halake, a Horn of Africa security analyst and a senior advocate at Refugees International. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Abdullahi. As is clear from that report there, the US is the most generous country in the world when it comes to foreign assistance. What does this freeze in US aid mean for the rest of the world in broad terms?
The freeze has sent a shockwave through many of the programs that the United States supports across the African continent. I think sometimes we forget that these programs, they go on in the background. So a lot of the time we do not know. Like the reporter mentioned there, PEPFAR, it's one of the most boring programs that not many people know. But PEPFAR is supporting over 20 million people with HIV, AIDS, and tuberculosis on the African continent. One of the programs that was also shut because of that of the freeze is FuseNet. That is food early warning system that really detects where there are food insecurities so that the United States and other donors can move in. And it relies on real-time data that are being collected. This program was started after the 1983-85 famine in Ethiopia. Currently, we are experiencing famine in certain parts of Sudan as we speak. We wouldn't know if that situation has changed. So we are speaking of...
Let me jump in, Abdullahi, and pose the question maybe from the Donald Trump America First agenda perspective. Why should the US carry that responsibility? Shouldn't local countries carry the responsibility?
Absolutely. I think for many, this is an opportunity for them to step up. But in the interim, let's be very clear that the food aid or any form of humanitarian aid is not just purely charity, because the United States also uses the humanitarian diplomacy to get some of the things that ideally won't get. So it is a loss for the United States as well, because it will lose the leverage that the aid or the humanitarian support that it gives to these countries lends the United States.
All right, that's a good point, Abdullahi. We'll pick up in a moment back on the point of the political aspects of this. But before we go too far down that road, Dave, first of all, what will happen after 90 days? Is it clear?
It's not clear. Let me just spend a moment responding to why this is in the U.S. interest. So, for instance, we've just halted monitoring of Ebola in Uganda. We've just halted monitoring of avian flu in 47 countries around the world, which is striking the United States and egg prices in America. As the previous guest just noted, we've halted PEPFAR, which remains still a scourge, HIV/AIDS as a disease that's difficult to battle. In the United States, we've halted malaria surveillance and TB surveillance. And we've halted the FuseNet, like your last guest noted, the famine early warning system. So this is a massive problem. We don't know what it will look like in 90 days, but here's what we can expect. There's been a purge of USAID senior leadership. There has been a widespread buyout option to all federal government employees. We can expect a much smaller federal government, a very weakened, perhaps non-existent USAID in 90 days, and a dramatic carve out and carve back of the assistance levels that we've seen.
Let's bring in Salai. Your organization, of course, works with a local community. Tell us what, even if this turns out, Salai, to be a temporary freeze, what has it made for some of the initiatives? What has it meant, rather, for some of the initiatives that your organization is working on? Have you been impacted?
Yes, certainly. We have been impacted by this freeze in a profound way. The freeze risks cutting off life-saving aid to one of the most vulnerable regions in Myanmar, which is already one of the most vulnerable in the entire world. And this is going to be devastating because we are experiencing, have been for the past 4 years, military violence from a military regime that came to power 4 years ago today. And this could also hamper our ability to document ongoing human rights abuses by the military, which is critical to accountability and ending impunity in Burma.
Salai, are lives at stake?
Yes, indeed, because what this cut means is that we would have to let go of medical professionals who are tending to some of the most vulnerable groups fleeing from the war, being displaced in very dire conditions, and they have no other alternative means of getting medical assistance or food aid. And without this, many people will be at risk of a serious situation like death.
Right, that's quite disturbing, obviously, to hear from someone like yourself who's working with people on the ground. Dave, we should put into context, though, that the order, the freeze, does have a waiver covering life-saving emergency programs and so on and so forth. But it's been reported that actually that waiver system is not effective, either because maybe some organizations don't know how to apply for the waiver, or if they do apply for it, they don't always get information on the status of their waiver. Is there a problem, Dave, with the system of waiver? The way it looks on paper might be fine, but when it's applied in reality?
Yes, there is. So let me set it out for your audience. So first, there was an exemption for food aid. And then secondly, there was an exemption for non-food humanitarian assistance. But it's really unclear. So for instance, FuseNet, the famine early warning system, is down, right? The other kind of critical points is that all of the contractors and the staff who ran the response emergency teams, both in Washington and abroad, have been let go. And so even if these exemptions are in place, it's not crystal clear who can manage, oversee, and be responsible for these responses. And I will say, in addition, what I know from my sources inside government is assistance to Gaza has been paused. Assistance to Syria has been paused during a transitional time. Assistance to Jordan has been paused, right? And this arc surrounding the Levant in the Middle East is vital for American interests and American security. And the chaos and the uncertainty and all that just gives space to adversaries.
All right. Abdullahi, when we put all of this into perspective, we know that the freeze order covered aid by certain programs, USAID, I think the Foreign Ministry of the US, the Secretary of State's aid programs. Does it cover other avenues, in other words, Abdullahi, for US assistance to reach some of the communities you've been talking about, cases of tracking Ebola in Nairobi, or organizations that keep babies on life support in Sudan?
I think sometimes it's reflected in how this administration just took a chainsaw through these processes. Yes, disease surveillance, which is very critical. I mean, we are talking about, for instance, the Democratic Republic of Congo right now, which is going through conflict in the eastern part. And there are reports of disease outbreak, that is Ebola, in Uganda. We have Marburg that has, we've had few cases in Tanzania. The way the system works is the CDCs, that is disease controls in those areas, share the samples with the CDC in the United States, and then you'll be able to track, and then the system will say, for instance, US citizens should not travel to country X or country Y. So in that sense, if this system is shut as we speak now, the results or the impacts will not just be on those countries. Yes, they have to step up and take care of their own. It will be also on the United States and other countries. I just want to give an example to the viewers that, look, this is nothing new. The UK government did something similar. And you know what happened? That office, when it was merged into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it just became a small shell of its former self. And with it, the United Kingdom's influence in the global stage completely diminished. Yes, America First is a good principle to get elected on, but America First that is being projected now really will end up in diminishing the status of the United States. And for most of those communities, therefore, it is going to be very, very difficult for the next couple of weeks and months ahead, but they might find ways of adjusting. But in the interim, it is going to be incredibly brutal.
All right, on that point, Salai, is it easy for organizations like yours to find those alternative sources of funding outside of USAID organizations?
Yes, well, we are exploring alternative funding sources, including private donors, faith-based organizations, and of
Is there a
course,
shift
other
towards looking at other countries like, China, India?
in the region? There's there's no support from the region, and it would have to be borne by larger countries like the EU or the UK, Canada, Australia, and we are exploring all possible sources of alternative funding. However, without US support, it will be incredibly difficult to maintain the scale of current operation and to meet the needs. We have 3.5 million people being displaced by the ongoing atrocities, and over 18 million people are in need of food assistance. So in that situation, it is extremely difficult to cope with the uncertainty created by the US freeze. And one critical solution we're advocating for at this point is the release of Myanmar's frozen $1 billion reserve fund held in New York since the coup. The interest alone amounts to about $200 million. This could provide much needed help that we desperately need without costing U.S. Taxpayer a penny. So this would significantly help keep our operation running, as well as support the human rights and democratic movement in the country. So we are appealing for the release of that fund at this point.
Dave, does the aid freeze weaken then US leverage around the world if, as we're hearing from Salai, communities are now having to look at other countries, other regions for support?
Yes, I think so. I mean, we should be clear that international development is just not a U.S. responsibility. It's a global responsibility, and other countries need to step up. So that from that perspective, it's fair. Secondly, USAID needs reform. Every administration does a review. All that is fine. The prior administration probably got too far out on a host of different projects and programs that weren't core to poverty alleviation and global health, right?
But Dave, is this administrative reform? Because earlier you used the word, which I found interesting, a purge going on. How much of this is purely administrative and how much of this is political to serve a political agenda or political goals?
This is 100% political. What I'm saying is, there's always a kernel of truth in any of these catastrophic events, right? USAID could use reform. USAID did go out too far on the margins for non-priority undertakings. But the fact of the matter is, you could have done a review while still continuing assistance. That's what every administration has done since the Kennedy administration. There's no need to purge the senior nonpartisan career leaders of the agency. It's like a decapitation of generals almost, within Washington. There's a chilling effect. USAID officials can't speak to anybody, not even at the State Department. And so what we're seeing is a political retribution that's designed to undermine the core principle of this statutorily independent and legal and congressionally authorized agency that's been around since the Kennedy administration. And so we are seeing a systematic attack against that. And the freeze of assistance is one component of it. It's not the only component.
Abdullahi, you touched earlier on the political aspect of this, so now might be a good time to come back to you and ask you to take apart the broader political impact of the US withdrawing its aid support, as Dave explained earlier, in some of those areas, critical areas. The Levant arc, I think, was the term Dave used when you look at the cutting back of aid in Syria, in Jordan, to support the Palestinians and so on. Does that leave a void which others, and maybe even countries which are, to put it nicely, in competition with the US, try and fill, like China and so on?
Absolutely. I think the similarity that we can draw with is development aid. Development aid for a very long time was primarily the United States and the European countries, until a couple of decades ago when China appeared on the scene, and their method of supporting that was completely different from the West. And what that gave China was a tremendous amount of leverage with most of those countries. Just to give you a sense, every single time when China-Africa summit is being called, I think there are not many African heads of state who misses those meetings compared to even the UN General Assembly. In aid, although it's very difficult, although it's very expensive compared to development aid that can be funded through debt and other means, China is not averse to taking advantage of this. Not just China, though. There are other middle-level Gulf countries that are exploring some of these avenues. Gulf countries, especially in the Horn of Africa, they have already started getting in. But the real challenge is, like Dave was saying, the purge really drains the system of really competent people. These are career people who know how to do, evaluation. These are people who know how to do, let's say, nutrition. So that is what will be lost. But I think that is not only one side of the ledger. Even on the other side, I think the United States will lose the leverage. Just to give you an example, the African countries at the UN General Assembly are almost a third of all the member states. United States and European countries have already lost that through development aid. Now, through humanitarian aid, if they lose that, if China comes to the Africa, humanitarian committee at the African Union and say, look, we'll step into this extent, that would really begin giving them a stronger foothold on the African continent, where, for instance, Joe Biden, during his last time, few weeks before he left, he visited Angola. The reason why he visited Angola was the United States is trying to build a railway that we call the Lobito Triangle that joins the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, and Luanda, Angola, for shipment of clean minerals that are used for clean, green energy to the United States and Europe. You lose that to China or other actors, that will definitely impact the United States as well.
Well, it might be a good point now for us to put some of this in the context of some numbers, because foreign aid is used by most governments as a tool to influence others. That's no surprise. And as a way to implement their foreign policies. In the US, it's a complex process with funds being distributed through a variety of agencies. According to a congressional report in 2022, about a quarter of all aid was spent on humanitarian assistance. That included things like life-saving food, medicine, and shelter for people suffering natural and man-made disasters. Just over a fifth went to global health initiatives. 18%, that was funneled into development supporting the economic, social, and political development of countries and communities. And another 18% went to what's classified as peace and security. That involves programs to help strengthen the military, police, and security forces of a recipient country. And just briefly, Dave, of course, that doesn't take into account all of the totality of military hardware aid assistance, right? When you start to add those numbers into that. I was looking up, according to that part of the aid, because it can get confusing, but according to that part of the aid, which is tracked by the foreignassistance.gov website, the bulk of US aid in 2023 has been on things like, the humanitarian needs, health and development, but 12% went towards military uses. Might that change now if some of the humanitarian and development aid is being frozen? Are we going to see that mix change?
You could. I mean, here's what's a little ironic. As you mentioned at the top of the show, aid for military assistance to Israel and Egypt was not frozen in all of this. So the United States, which has not been particularly balanced on Israel-Palestine, is now in a position of freezing aid to Gaza and all of the food aid and the humanitarian assistance, despite the waivers, and increasing or allowing the assistance to Israel to go forward. And so, that just creates a legitimacy issue that I think doesn't serve us well. By the way, I just noted that the Trump administration is considering unholding or releasing 24,000 assault rifles to Israel for use in the West Bank and Gaza, mainly for the settlers. Okay, this is in the context of the aid freeze globally and in the Levant.
All right. There's always money for guns when it comes to policies, it seems. Salai, is the ultimate outcome, perhaps, of this a growing black hole of even knowledge or information of what the situation is, a vicious circle where organizations which track and document crises have to stop their work?
There's certainly a big risk to that. And documentation and recording crimes are extremely important in holding perpetrators to account, and that's not just for the purpose of justice, just accountability. It's for justice for the victims, and we owe it to the people who have suffered so much from tyrannical regimes around the world.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Let's thank all of our guests for their contributions. Dave Harden, Salai Ling, and Abdullahi Boru Halake. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle there is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.